welcome. My name is Michael Gianangeli. I'm a first-year MBA at the MIT and the lead for the basketball panel. We have some really great panelists here today, and it is my honor to introduce them. First, we have Tom Thibodeau, former coach of the Bulls. Second, we have Brian Kopp, president of Catapult. Third, we have Brian Scalabrine, former player and current analyst. Fourth, we have Mike Zarin, the AGM of the Celtics. And this panel is moderated by Zach Lowe of the ESPN. The panel will last for 45 minutes with time at the end for Q&A. If you do have a question, please use the hashtag #Hackastat and also the hashtag SSAC16. With that, I hand it over to you, Zach. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to the annual Basketball Analytics panel, where we have someone who grew up a Celtics fan, the assistant GM of the Celtics legend Brian Scalabrine, podium legend Brian Scalabrine, Brian Kopp with no connection to the Celtics, and former Boston Celtics assistant coach Tom Thibodeau. So there's no bias on this panel at all. 3 NBA champions on stage here. How are you guys doing? Everyone good?
We're good. Right.
So we do this every year. We have the Basketball Analytics panel every year. We talk about the same stuff. The nerds and the jocks and who can talk to who and how do we communicate and blah, blah, blah. I kind of feel like analytics have solved basketball. Like, the analytics thing is over. We know how, like, the most efficient team should play. Every team except, I mean, every team has an analytics guy now. It's part of the process now. So I guess my question is, like, what's left to do? Like, what's left to learn? What can we learn from all this, the Sport View cameras and the Catapult technology with the wearable devices? You got all this stuff or some of this stuff. Like, are we just down to the point where all we can learn is, like, granular lineup data and pick and roll combinations, and should we ice and should we show and blah, blah? Like, what are you using this stuff for now?
But that's everything, right, Zach?
I guess that's everything.
I mean, if you're a coach, those are all the things that you've been talking about for 30 years. Now we actually can, like, look at those things with data.
So what are you doing? What are you doing right now?
I just got back from the Big East tournament.
Well, I don't care about that. What are you doing with the analytics? What are you studying? Like, what are you looking at the data for?
It hasn't changed. It's just we've got better data, right? So we're just looking at every single thing that the franchise is going to make a decision. Like, every decision we make, we've got more information about it, right? The beauty of where we're at now is, it used to be the first year of this conference, people were talking about, adjusted field goal percentage and rebounding percentage, and those aren't the things that coaches talk about during practice. They talk about, defending pin down screens. Well, now we know where all the pin down screens happen in every NBA game, and we can actually say, all right, you didn't just have a video guy watch the last 5 games, although you should probably do that too. Here's how this team has done against this kind of defense all year. And so we're just spending more time looking at each of those questions with better information. The beauty of where we're at now versus where we were at the first one of these conferences is you actually can speak the coach's language. And so as a result, there isn't this blurring. There's, like, the data. It'll surprise me if you ever hear Brad or Danny say, well, our analytics say X. Because it's just part of our staff. Our staff says X.
Okay.
I mean, now someone will catch me on that probably. But we've really come a very, very long way with this stuff. But there's still every question to answer. I feel like there's so much about basketball.
Really? Okay, so just little, like, Coach, you were the head coach of the Bulls during the time when we kind of made a leap in analytics, right? From, like, the very beginnings of this conference to now we have all this fancy stuff. Like, what did you ask for day to day? Like, what kind of stuff did you want to know about your own team, about the opponents? Like, what did you want delivered to you?
Well, at the beginning of the season, you determined we would have a stat pack on our team, our opponent, and then a post-game report. And it'd be a compilation of a lot of things to prepare your game plan. And as Mike mentioned, and I worked in Boston, got a lot of stuff from him, and I worked in Houston and got a lot of stuff from Daryl as well. Prior to that, I was in New York, and Pat Riley was there, and he had used a number of different things that we started with. So we continued to add to it, and it's a compilation of a lot of things. And I think, as you prepare offensively, there's certain shots you're trying to get to. The obvious are the layups, the free throws, and the corner threes. So defensively, those are the shots that you're trying to take away. And then to get your team to understand, we don't want to put people at the foul line because of points per possession. So you got to work on technique. So you're not fouling. You're going to do things that are going to take away the layup, and do things that are going to take away the corner three, and then you want to force them into the long twos. And you have to have your team have an understanding that even if someone makes a couple of those shots, and there's ways you can influence the ball, where the ball handler is going to bring the shot back to the defender, and that's going to be an even lower percentage. And if they make a couple of those shots, that shot's not going to beat you. So having your team understand that, and after every game, we would go over those shots that we gave up, the shots that we got, and then I thought that helped us a lot in understanding what we were trying to do.
I kind of feel like you would have figured that out anyway. You're a pretty smart coach. I kind of feel like you would have figured out corner threes and layups and rim and long twos. What was something concrete that you learned from data that you didn't know? Was there ever something you did not know about the game or your team or an opposing player, some nugget that you're like, oh, that's actually something that is the opposite of what I thought, or something I learned that I didn't know?
I think, when you start studying the numbers and you're looking at a certain team, they may say, you hear the word pace and space, or, everyone's pace and space. And then when you really dig into the numbers, you realize that it's really not their pace. It's the shooting that they have. Their pace may be a lot lower than you think. The efficiency, to me, is more important. Scoring margin, more important, because the teams that advance are strong on both sides of the ball. So you have to look at the numbers and see if they're showing that, what they're saying is what they're doing.
Scal, during your brief and not at all dramatic coaching stint with the Golden State Warriors, what kind of stuff did you want to look at? I mean, you were recently retired from the game. You're young. This is in your wheelhouse. What kind of stuff did you look at?
So when I used analytics, it was only to support what I saw in film. So I don't know if I could just go and look at, say, well, this guy, when he goes right, he scores this many points per possession, but when he goes left, it's less. Because there's so much things that you have to go, so many different ways you have to go into that. You can't tell your team, all right, this guy we're going to force right, and that guy we're going to force left. So every guy, you have a different way of guarding him. You got to come up with a consistent way of doing it. So you have to watch film. The points per possession that you see on a piece of paper do not tell you anything until you go and watch the film. Agreed. I think the biggest thing the analytics do is they support your thoughts of what you saw on film. When this guy is on the left side, he seems to get across and get downhill. I have to watch that, and I have to look at the points per possession to make it all. See, I can't just go in and say, I've watched film, I've watched 10 clips, and I think these are pretty good. I got to have some data to back that up. And I think the whole thing about analytics is, I'm good with it, but you have to watch the film.
But I think everyone knows that, right? I mean, there's no
everyone
one that's
knows
not.
What?
Everyone knows that the analytics guys are watching film too.
You're funny how when you started, you think analytics is you think, where can we go with analytics? And what's the next step? My point would still be, Draymond Green is out there coming off the bench for the Warriors for 3 years, and he's one of the best players in the NBA. So what are the analytics telling us? If everything is already out there, how does Draymond Green go from that to what he is right now?
When you say the analytics, what do you mean?
Well, Zach acts like everything is already known.
I don't know what the analytics
I'm
thing
saying
is.
this, but so what did the analytics? What did the analytics say about Draymond Green? You were there when he was coming off the bench.
Actually, Mike Zarin said that Draymond Green was probably a top 3 player coming out of the draft, and he was picked 35th. So clearly, analytics have a long ways to go.
Why didn't you pick Draymond Green?
Yeah, why didn't you pick Draymond Green? You showed me your report. It's like Anthony Davis, somebody else, and Draymond Green. He went 35th.
Somebody else might have been Sully, who we picked.
Okay, he's pretty good. He's all right.
Every team missed Draymond Green in the first round.
I'm saying analytics have
tough to pick them both.
They have a long ways to go. We have a long ways to go as far as evaluating players, not just lineups, how a guy plays. can you take analytics and measure Draymond Green's heart and say, wow, man, he's got a great heart.
Ten,
It's
10 years of this
7
conference
point.
and we still have this question.
Yeah, I mean,
But you can-
I'm a player. That's what I
You kind of can, right? Though, like Brian, your stuff will measure. I mean, heart. I don't know what that means, but like you will measure things like how often does Draymond Green cut really hard and run really fast? Like that kind of stuff is measurable now.
Yeah, but I think it's when we started doing Sport View, I remember talking to Mike about this in the early days, and people assume that when you have new data, it's going to flip everything on its head. And that was never the point. It was to do, I mean, there's a lot of coaches out there that are great at their job. And like you said, it's really just further advancing what you already know, but in a different way. Maybe challenging a couple things, but most of it is to keep reinforcing what you know, maybe thinking in a different way.
That sounds dangerous to me. That sounds like we already know everything, so we're only going to look at the numbers that back up what we think.
But it doesn't mean it's not like we're 20% of the way there and something's going to come along and fill in the other 80. It's a process, and that process is a long process, and it's off of
when you were
primarily coaching experience.
No, go.
Look, it's like we knew you have to run a lot during a basketball game, right? That's something everyone knew. You knew that from watching plenty of film, right? So should you train to run 3 miles or 5 miles? Those are pretty different training regimes you might do, right? We didn't know until we installed the cameras in the playoffs in 2010 how far you guys were running during games.
Remember how far Rondo thought
That was
we ran?
crazy. Yeah.
Rondo thought he ran like, he probably
So
ran
we
like
asked
8
Rajon.
miles.
We did the cameras, the first NBA installation of those cameras. It was crazy. We had to like ship a hard
Oh, it was
drive to
ridiculous. It was
Chicago, and then
ridiculous.
it was 2 weeks later. The data would come back from Israel somehow. It was, I don't know. I was
He's not
actually
exaggerating.
carrying
He's not
a drive
exaggerating
to
at all.
Brian's hotel room at like 11 p.m. after the playoff game. So we asked Rajon how far he ran in that first game against Miami in the first round in 2010, and he said he thought he ran 7, 8 miles. And we asked Brian Dew, our strength and conditioning coach, and he said 3.5 to 4 miles. And it turns out he ran 4.2 miles in that game.
Okay.
You're going to
Which
train
was a
pretty,
lot. It was
which is a
actually a
lot.
lot.
That
That's a
was
lot of
actually the
running.
highest on our team that game. Although I think for that season it was Ray was a little bit ahead of Rajon. But you know, you're going to train pretty differently if you know these things, right? So I don't know if that's analytics or the thing you were saying about pick and rolls.
Well,
Is
I
that,
think
I'm
you're
not
always
sure what any
going
of
to
these things
train
are.
that way because you
Right.
have an understanding of how important conditioning is.
It's just
And-
better information,
But
right?
and that the collection of data is great. That's what the technology is doing, and then we have to make sure what we're measuring is important and it's accurate. And then how do you use it? And the idea should be, I think, with sports science is we have the ability now to collect that data, but not to have guys miss practice and miss games. It should be to use that information so guys can practice and play. Because the only way you're going to be able to execute is really through repetition. That's how you improve your execution. And so that part is important. I think right now, like we can collect things and we can get that information quickly, but we got to make sure that we know what to do with it. And then at the end of the season to evaluate, are we having less injuries or are we having more injuries? Because that should be the idea behind it, not that we're just using so we could collect data. That's great. But how are we using it, and how can we use it effectively? I think the same thing with analytics. That we can collect a lot more information, but we have to make sure it's accurate also. And then how do you impart that and use it so it's efficient for you?
Well, I was going to save this for later, but we might as well get into it now. You were perhaps at the epicenter of an NBA debate over sports science analytics and minutes and rest and fatigue and all of that stuff. And I actually think those are the more interesting analytics now to me, is what we're going to learn about players' bodies and how they train and how they move on the court and how a shooting guard moves versus how a power forward moves and what it means for someone to shift down a position in the playoffs, what it means for their body. So, like, the minutes thing is, I think, the defining controversy of your time in Chicago. We have all this data now from Catapult. I don't know if you had it with the Bulls. Did they have it with the Bulls? Okay. Would you have been, I know you think you've been unfairly branded about the minute stuff as someone who overplayed
it's all
guys.
Fair. Fair and accurate, yeah.
Would you have listened to this data? Would you have been receptive to reading it? Would you have been receptive to feedback about maybe the shoot around should be shorter?
I'll read everything.
Okay.
And then I think you also have to look at the circumstances of your team. And so if you look closely, you would see that the guys that were high minutes for me, which was Luol Deng and Jimmy Butler, it was reflective of other guys at that position and what they were playing. So usually you would have those guys matched up together. So when Kevin Durant's in the game, Luol's going to be in the game. When LeBron's in the game, Luol's going to be in the game. And otherwise, they're going to have a distinct advantage. And when you're down your best player, you can't afford that. Your margin of error is a lot smaller. So, and across the board, so the last couple of years, minutes have come down a little bit. But you also have to remember if a team is shorthanded, and it all depends on where your team is. Do you have young guys? Do you have older guys? So, but I like the information in terms of how you're going to prepare, how you're going to practice, what it tells you. And if you told me, hey, look, if you play this guy, if he never plays more than 32 minutes, he'll never get hurt, right? No, I wouldn't play a guy. But there's no guarantee. A guy could get hurt at the beginning of the game, the middle of the game, at the end of the game. And the data has not been collected long enough to really make a determination of what is accurate. You know, we just started doing it.
And part of it, I think, as coaches, well, you're a former coach who's never going back because it's a non-glamorous life. Let's face it, you know.
The worst.
but you can you can both speak to
Guy
this.
like
It's like,
shows up to the game, you know, says a few things, goes home.
It's good.
it's very easy for someone on the outside to say, Jimmy Butler played too many minutes. Luol Deng played too many minutes.
Why? But why do you guys say that?
I don't. Who's you guys?
Okay. Whoever is saying it, whoever you guys are that's saying it. Jimmy Butler plays 37 minutes, it's okay, but if he plays 38, it's not.
I don't know. I
What
don't
if
know.
you found out, not in a game-to-game situation, but what if you found out after a certain number of games that suddenly Jimmy's moving a lot more slowly and cutting a lot more slowly than he was before? In a way that other people who've played a lot also slow down right before they get hurt.
My point
Would you stop playing him
yeah,
as much then?
No, that's why.
Because that's all
when
I
you
think
started this whole
Brian's
thing,
talking about.
This is all, like, this is the next advance.
That's why he's on the panel.
Yeah, this is the next advance. Like, Tibbs knows pick and roll. I don't know anything. Zarin knows everything. This is where you're going to go. If you want to know, like, if Jimmy Butler should be playing 35 minutes, I want you to tell me that. If Jimmy Butler's supposed to be playing 32 minutes, I want you to tell me that. And it has to be definitive.
That's a lot of pressure.
Well, is it definitive? Like,
No,
I hear,
we're
can you go to
getting there.
management and say, no, he's okay, he's not going to get hurt?
Well, it's a complicated question, right? I mean, and part of what Coach is saying is not all minutes are the same. And what you want to know, some people think sports science means play less, don't play as hard. It's not. If you need a guy to play 40, 45 minutes, then you train him and get his body ready to play 40, 45 minutes. And that's really what it's about. And so if you want to put it into the flow of your team, because some teams, you're playing 40 minutes and you might be standing in the corner versus running around chasing the guy around. So
Made a career out of it.
40 minutes would
Really
be
in the
nice.
corner on the
Someone,
bench.
Hey, look, you just spent the last 15 minutes backstage telling us how central you were to everything that happened that was good in Boston and Chicago and Golden State.
The analytics would say that. So what does that mean about analytics?
So,
I mean, there are some numbers that support that I was the best fifth starter on the team with Ray, Paul, Garnett, and Rondo, and Scal. That was the best team the Celtics had.
look,
The numbers will back it.
They fit well
He didn't know
around you.
that. I had to show him. Like, remember that 7 games? Remember that 7 games where we went 7-0?
He was trying to justify a 5-year contract off those.
So
7 games. Remember the big 7 games?
we have officially gone off the rails.
We got a lot of time. I got a clock.
You do got a lot of time. You
don't seem to have any questions.
I got a lot of questions. I'm gonna ask Tom a question right now. Tibbs, what I was going to ask you before we got off on a scout tangent was, so it's easy for the outsiders to say these guys played too many minutes, but coaches, like, look how many coaches have gotten fired in the last 4 months. Like, coaches need to win every game to save their jobs, with the exceptions of the guys like Pop and Rick who have endless job stability, right? So, like, minute 39 of Jimmy Butler, minute 40 of Jimmy Butler is still better, even if he's tired and fatigued and cutting slowly, is still better than minute 1 of Jimmy Butler's backup, right? I mean, that sort of, so these are all sorts of organizational dynamics, the pressure to win, the fact that a fatigued Jimmy is better than a backup, whoever, like, that's real, right? I mean, you got to win every game.
I think you have to compare apples to apples. To me, it's that. So if you're evaluating, and you know, the ability to collect the data is important. But if you're collecting the data at game 60 on Jimmy Butler and where he is, and you'd like to be able to compare it to where everyone is at game 60, you know, is that averaging out to what you're looking at? because players are going to, as the season goes on, it changes. And then as a coach, you're pacing the team, so you're probably practicing a lot less at that point of the season. So your practices are probably an hour or less. And now, so you're going to base it on those decisions. And to your point, you know, when you look back, like I had an opportunity to talk to Michael Jordan about it. He said he conditioned himself all year round to play 40 minutes a night. And he said that was important. And I had an opportunity to spend some time with Marcus Elliott at P3, and that was his thing about taking the information that you get from the sports science and condition yourself to prepare yourself to play 4 games in 5 nights. And I know he worked with Kyle Korver when I had Kyle in Chicago, and he did a phenomenal job with him. And Kyle swears by him, and he said he saved his career. So it was how he took that information that he gained from P3 and used it to really get himself into great shape so he can perform well, and he's had a tremendous career.
Right. I think the key here is really one thing we've learned over many years of medical science, it's not sports related, is that people are very different from each other. And so to Scal's point, the analytics, whatever, I still don't know what that means, but whatever that is, it's not going to say no one should play 36 minutes or everybody should have a cap. It's told us sometimes that we have guys who should play harder or who should practice harder. Like, you're not training hard enough to do the things that we need you to do in a game. Other guys are, you know, they've got too much load and you have to dial it back. And it's very much an individual thing.
Well, I think you said the key word when you were talking about the minutes is fatigue. And at that point, it's a balance between, yeah, he may be better than the backup, but if you push him too hard, he's going to get hurt. And then your backup's playing 40 minutes. So it's a balance between, I need him out there. I think it's different from a game in the middle of December and January, and when you're in May and June, and it's game 7, you got to win this game. Sports science goes out the window. Guys are out there, and you're just trying to gut through it. But it's really about managing that fatigue, managing those players, and making sure they peak at the right time so that we're there at the end of the season.
So you work for Catapult. You're the wearables guy now, one of the wearables guys. So I'm going to put your stuff on and practice, and you're going to learn a lot about how I move. And hopefully at some point, I think one D-League team wears them now.
Yeah, well, a couple do.
A couple D-League teams wear them now.
They can wear them
so,
in
like, I have your device on my team. I want to get very literal. Like, what are the numbers? What are the analytics? Like, I queue up whatever I've got in my database. Like, what do I see? Do I see cuts, accelerations? Like, what are the numbers that matter to me as a team?
Yeah, I mean, Mike said one is player load, which is taken into account.
I don't know what
all
that
of
is,
your
player load.
movements.
What does that mean?
It takes into account all of your different movements. It's a formula we have that says all of your different movements in a lot of different areas, and it gives you a number. And it gives you a number for, it's kind of an equivalent to miles, but in a much better way. So player load is what was your effort today? How much did you physically, and it wasn't effort like you tried hard, but how much physically did you go today? And we give it a number, and it's based on very complicated math.
Do people that get the numbers understand them? Like, does it matter to me if, like, oh, my load is 16 today?
Yeah.
That's
Once you create a baseline, just like everything, if you go out and you got 5 rebounds, is that good, bad? It kind of depends on your situation. You start to create a baseline with player load.
Good.
And yeah, exactly. For some people, really good.
Some people not so good.
Scott, would you have wanted to know that stuff when you were a player?
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's the misconception. I think most NBA players want to be the best they can be. They want to make the most money, and they don't want to be embarrassed out there. So the more data you can have to become a better player, it's just most guys want to do that. Now, there are some exceptions. Some people, they just want to focus on basketball, and they don't want to get into that. Listen, I'm going to go hard. If I feel tired, I'll tell you. But, to both your guys' point, there are some guys, like on the Celtics right now, who can play long stretches of minutes, and they don't drop off. And some guys can play, 5-minute gaps at a time. You guys remember? You guys didn't have wearables with Garnett, or maybe you did, but Doc was just using them 4 minutes at a time when he was older. And he played.
We put the cameras in, and that had some influence on that.
And he found out after 5 minutes that he dropped off. And so Doc just, subbed him every 5 minutes. And he got a lot of productivity out of Garnett late in his career. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But once again, I'm telling you guys, this is the way it's going. And we were just talking in the back. The biggest thing, you have from the cameras, 2 guys come together and they hit and they create an impact. That impact is going to be a lot different the next day than if they come together and right at the last minute, this guy avoids the screen and gets around that. I don't know if your cameras can pick that up, but you're working on things now in which it can actually determine what the impact is per, and this guy took 7 hits that were this much force, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the evolution I went through is with the sport review data, there's a lot you can do, but there is a limit. And that limit, where that starts, is where when you put something on a player and collect more granular data, it takes it to the next level. And it starts with the physicality. It starts with impacts. It starts with cuts, acceleration, things that really measure what your body's going through. To me, we're not that far away from taking that information, the other statistical information we have, and putting them together. So you want to know jump shots off dribbles. How about jump shots when you have certain accelerations into that shot? When you make certain cuts, when you set not just 10 screens, but 10 really hard screens. And you start to measure all that impact on your body. I mean, it's done in sports from around the world, but being able to tie that back into what does it mean? Right now, sports science is a very trainer, strength coach area. You know, forward-thinking guys like Mike Zarin are thinking about how can I take that into the front office? How can I not just make decisions on minutes played and fatigue, but how does that actually impact your output when you're out there playing? So when Garnett did that and they said, okay, 4 minutes at a time, there was a little bit of guesswork in there. You know, some of it was the cameras, but you can be much more precise with more data. And again, it's not, I appreciate you saying, I'm going to tell you how many minutes. I'll never tell you how many minutes, but we'll tell you, here's what the information says. And then coach will make that determination. And he'll say, okay, based on this, we'll dial it back, or we won't. Or he'll say, you know what, we need to win these 5 games. We're going out there and we're rolling the dice.
The minutes played are not the only way to pace your team. So if you've got an older guy and he's playing 32 minutes for you, the next day, like with a Kevin Garnett, you would have him, he'd still be with the starters, but you'd have a sub for him. So he wouldn't do nearly as much. He might not do anything.
The problem is he's still running up and down on the side.
Well, I mean, that part,
Can't stop him.
you know, for him, the conditioning component was really important, you know, and that's finding that balance. Like you just mentioned earlier, like Rajon Rondo ran 4.2 miles in a game, so you need to be conditioned to run 4.2 miles in a game. Garnett was a great multiple effort guy, played with great energy, and to prolong his career, that was the smart thing to do, to use him in smaller increments during the game, but also to take it back a little bit in practice for him. But for a young guy who needs work, right, who has to learn the NBA game and develop, he probably has to work a little bit harder. And when you look at all those guys, when they were younger in their career, if you look at a Garnett or you look at a Tim Duncan, what you see is they played big minutes when they were young. And so, and the end result is to get the best performance possible out of the player and to win. And you can't lose sight of what the main thing is, and that's the winning.
The people on the cutting edge of this stuff, and you can probably, we've already been speaking around it. If someone told me the other day, in 10 years, we're going to look back at our obsession over minutes played and think, well, that was quaint. That was cute how we thought the minutes were important because we just didn't know anything. It's the quality of those minutes. What happens when you're on the floor? What position do you play? What are you doing? Who do you come in? Who do you hit on the court? That stuff is we're going to look back on the minutes thing and think it's silly. And this is like a progressive, forward-thinking guy on this. And he thinks, someone told me we're going to get to a point where the sensor between your shoulder blades that you guys produce, people are going to be wearing 5 or 6 of those tiny things in their uniforms all around their body, in their sock, in their shoe, wherever, to measure everything. Like, how far away are we from that?
I mean, I personally think it's not going to be all kinds of things around your body. I think it's going to be smarter with 1 or 2 things. I mean, I think what you could do with things in a shirt, I think the apparel companies will figure something out that you can link into what we capture. Because what you're really talking about is you want movement, which is what our devices capture, and then you want how your body responds to it, your heart rate and your physicality. So you want to be able to know not just how far you ran, but if you ran a lot of high accelerations and your heart rate's spiking versus not, that tells you 2 different stories. So if you can have a way, and right now the way they collect heart rate is these annoying straps that no one likes to wear those things, but you need that to be very accurate. But if you have a smart shirt that collects that kind of information, tie it back to what we collect with the movement, that gives you everything you need. Everything else is probably nice to have, but isn't going to be something that's going to really change that core. And quite frankly, I think a player would probably not want to have too many things on their body because then you're getting a little bit crazy. But 1 or 2 things really integrated, but telling you things that are meaningful, I think that's where it's going.
And you got to get them on.
That was our problem when we started wearing them. That the players sometimes would wear them, sometimes they wouldn't. During practice, they would fall off, and then they wouldn't wear it the rest of practice. And then we're trying to draw information from that, but it's not accurate. You're not wearing it every day. You're not you take it off halfway through
About
practice.
the heart rate thing,
Yeah, the
yeah.
shirts were better. They seem to like the shirts better. But that's where, like, I think over time you sort of figure out what works best for your team, and then you can use that information better.
We got to, like, the next step is it's got to be, you just mentioned it, we don't have information because teams aren't allowed to wear them during games, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, that's the next step. Would you be okay wearing them during games knowing, yeah?
I just sit on the bench.
The thing, but see, like that, and that's part of the problem.
And Scala's heart rate didn't move
In
at
the
all.
fourth quarter.
No, but that's the problem. Is in practice, you're never going to get to the intensity level of a game in practice.
Not even in your practice?
No. And then,
I want to stand up. His practices are so over. Like, they think, oh, man, he drives the team. He's hard, but we barely impact. The whole season, we'd have a couple days where we would scrimmage. It was hard pushing conditioning, and he was on you, but it wasn't like these guys are 2.5 hours. That is such a misconception about Thibodeau and his practices. They're not like that at all.
Okay, there you go, Tibbs.
my man, Scal,
I just tell
I
the
might
truth.
have another year for you.
Would you be, so if we wear them in games, this is probably, you probably never imagined this reality. If you wear them, what are you going to
No,
say?
you need to have them worn in games.
Well, that's a fight, though. You got to. That's a fight.
Whoa.
There's all sorts of
This is
legal
where
issues
I would
there.
get in trouble if I say any more.
But we'll get to a point where, as coaches, maybe in 10 years or something, you'll have data on the sidelines being like, okay, Derrick Rose is jumping 3% or 10%, lower on his jump shot than he was 5 minutes ago. We got to take him out. Like real time, real in game. Like his cuts are like.
But
do you
again,
want?
you have to compare apples to apples. The intensity of the fourth quarter is a lot different than the first 3 quarters. So, like, if you're measuring then and you're saying, well, there's going to be more contact, the physicality is different, the numbers are going to be different. But that's what I'm saying. We have to have the ability to get those numbers from the game and not just use practice. And so I think that, like right now, the technology is great because we can collect the data, but we got to make sure that it's that data that we can use.
Yeah, more data is going to mean more mistakes too by people. You got to have reliable stuff.
What kind of
I mean,
mistakes?
it's the same as anything else you do. Someone can watch video and not be paying attention to what's happening on the court. Someone can, be a not very good statistician, or a coach could not understand the limitations of the data. Or you could do exactly what Tom was just saying, right? You could be looking at fourth quarter numbers and comparing them to first quarter numbers and say there's something wrong when it's actually the game is different.
And to Scal's point about like practice, one of the reasons I didn't want to scrimmage, I didn't want the physicality of body on body, and I thought you'd be more susceptible to injury that way. So we try to do more, 3-on-0, 5-on-0, controlled, where you knew what the action that was coming was, so we could build habits defensively, and that's mainly how we practice.
So Tom's smart, and he's been at this a long time. And
Yes.
after a while, we're going to be able to figure out, well, how much physicality in practice, can you have? Is there a cliff at some point? We don't know.
Well, at some
So you're
point
gonna
there will
find
be
that
a
out.
coach who's told they can't practice for 2 weeks, or we can't have shoot around, or like so. That's going to be a hard discussion, right? I mean, those are going to be real discussions that happen.
The schedule might do that to you anyway.
Well, that's what I was
Well,
going to
the
say.
sleep is the big thing, and
Yeah.
I think everyone is much more aware of that. Like, and when I was in Houston, Daryl was big on, like, when we would obviously play a lot of games out west. So we'd stay over after the game and then fly the next day. We weren't going to practice versus leave after the game, get home at 3 or 4 in the morning. And so, like, the real sleep is where you're going to get your rest. If you're resting a guy in practice and he's got it off and he's out all night, that is counterproductive.
that might be
It's
the
not
problem
gonna
with staying over too, though.
This is the biggest thing. I love, like, the application of all this. Let's just take a few things. Let's say we have numbers, and right now LeBron James is over the limit, and we need to sub him out. It's the fourth quarter. It's 6 minutes to go in the game, and
No one's gonna do that.
The data says to sub LeBron out, right? So we should do that, or Kobe in his prime, or whoever moving forward, right? That's so ridiculous. Some guys, I think that you were in a situation where you had a minute kind of restriction, and you went into overtime, right? So you're sitting there like, well, what am I supposed to do? I have 5 more minutes to play. I can't take the guy out, but you got to do what you got to do. I think that's just so overblown.
Well, why is it binary like that, though, right? So there's some
I don't know
point
why
at
it's
which-
binary like that. I mean, some people put minute
Well,
restrictions
maybe
on
it's
people.
maybe it's the next day then. Maybe it's you play the guy
That's
in
what I would
overtime,
say, right? It's not concrete. The other one would be the stay in the night. Maybe if you had wearables, they should wear them all night and see what they're doing at 4 in the morning. Because we stay over in LA to get our rest, and then we go right from the bus. From the club to the bus to the plane. That's not rest. You can tell. You walk up and down the plane, and everyone's asleep in the middle of the day. What's the point of that? How is that helping the team?
Scout, when you were playing, you said that was rest.
No, that was my game time. You got to know when to bring it.
Let's do some quick ones related to this. You're going to have to not answer this question. Should there be 82 games?
That's a great question. The thing I don't like about what's happening now is I just don't like the idea of we're selling tickets to people to watch players play, and maybe it is too many games. I don't know. I would want to look at that data, but I don't think it's good if you go to a game and there's 3 players sitting out, and it might be the right thing for the players. But for the game, I think it's not good. I think when you go to a game, if someone could play, they should play.
Cop?
I think any sports scientist that came from another sport that comes to basketball looks at the schedule and says, this is crazy. So just from that standpoint, they say it doesn't make sense, but it's a very complicated thing to unravel from an overall business standpoint, because you're right. I mean, you can't take away games, and you want the best players out there, but how do you balance, I'll sit a couple good guys now versus they're going to miss the last 20 games because they're hurt. So I think from a scheduling standpoint, it's just hard because it's a volume and a condensed time period. A lot of sports around the world, they spread it out a lot more. I mean, it's rare that, baseball obviously a little bit different, but for a sport, basketball and hockey are the two that's very physical and a lot of traveling and condensed scheduling, and that's kind of very rare versus sports around the world where it's either spread out more or their traveling isn't as great.
I think that's one thing that Adam's really looking hard at, to get the back-to-backs, to get those, reduce them as much as we can to eliminate the 4 and 5s. And those are the markers that I think are bad. Like if we can reduce those, maybe we start a week earlier, shorten the break at the All-Star, go maybe a little later, just so there's less back-to-backs.
You're chipping away at it. What were you going to say? Well,
That's what I was saying. I was like, why 6 to 8 preseason games? 1 week of practice, start playing games. There's another 21 days you can stretch out, maybe even stretch it another week. The first round in the playoffs takes I think 3 months, right? I mean, it's ridiculous
long.
how
It's
long
a
it takes
slog.
to go through. So you can stretch it out. You'll just eliminate. I don't think back-to-backs are as big as 4 and 5. Guys that play back-to-backs, they seem to be able to bring it if they have this carrot at the end, 2 days off afterwards.
But so the beauty of this is there's data now, so we're going to find out. It's not going to be about I think. There's a paper here today, right, that says some things about
Well, they
about
already
this, but
have made some adjustments. This year is much better, and I think it'll continue. But I think getting those numbers down is important.
And we've got people at the league office who are very excited to look at this kind of question, which I think is also a change. So, I think there's an answer to the question, which is different. Before it's just been I think.
Right. You
But
guys
there's
played,
money involved too, right?
Well, there might be. You guys played the Rockets last night.
We did.
I'm going to say crushing defeat to the Houston Rockets. Maybe a season-defining defeat for the Boston Celtics against the Rockets.
Harsh.
And the Rockets play
Media, man,
all
media.
all threes, all rim, all free throws, right? And the Sixers, who are run organizationally by one of Daryl's proteges, play all 3, all rim, all free throws. They're kind of interesting in that there's a clear organizational mandate from the top. This is who we're going to play almost no matter what kind of players we have. So the Sixers guys, they can't shoot, and when they attack the rim, they miss, but we're going to play that way, okay? Houston has okay shooting, but Corey Brewer, you shoot 29% from 3. That's mathematically still more favorable to us than so-and-so shooting a mid-range jumper. So fire away, throw up these bricks from the corners. I guess my question is how do you balance the analytics of that's the way you should play versus who you have? And the follow-up is particularly to the guy who used to play the game at this level, is this a fun game to watch for you right now? Are we gonna? And we're gonna. By the way, we haven't reached the ceiling of threes. We're not even close to it, right? I mean, so I don't know that anyone could answer that.
You want to go first? Or
Yeah,
me?
listen. I knew this was going to happen. Like when I started playing, we went against the Phoenix Suns in the spread pick and roll. Spread pick and roll is the hardest thing to defend. You hear about Thibodeau talking about the corner threes. If you have to sit in the lane and you're the help man on a pick and roll, yet your man is out at three, and there's a point guard that's coming down, you are at the mercy of him. So the spread pick and roll is not going to go anywhere, and because that's not going to go anywhere, it's not just the shooting and making the three, it's the spacing that it provides. So having Kelly Olynyk out there, if he doesn't make one shot, allows Isaiah Thomas to turn the corner. Watch those two when they're together. Yeah. If I have Kelly Olynyk and I'm helping on Isaiah, I might be a little hesitant to get back to my man. So the idea of getting layups and getting threes, that's a result of, this is the hardest thing in the NBA to guard. I mean, isolation, I mean, maybe Tom would say something differently, but isolation from a team standpoint, not that tough, and it's easy to defensive rebound out of it. Spread pick and roll, man, you are on roller skates the whole day, and I think a lot of, like, Mike D'Antoni doesn't get enough credit for what he did with that Phoenix Suns team because they didn't win it. Right now you hear everyone talking about small ball, it's Golden State, or wow, look at the Spurs pass the ball. Listen, the Phoenix Suns played small ball and they passed the ball too. They just didn't win a championship, so it's not trendy.
I think this stuff's way more fun to watch. So there's sort of two questions in your question, right?
Yeah,
so one
yeah.
of them's like about the state of the game,
Yeah.
and the other's about organizational priorities. So on the first one, I think the game's much more fun to watch now than it was in like the late 90s. But maybe that's because the Celtics are good now.
Could be.
I think part of it, when you watch highlights, there's always going to be the dunks, but more and more of those highlights are Steph hitting some crazy three with a guy right in his face and making 8 passes to get a great shot. I mean, those are the highlights now, and it's exciting.
There's more people who talk to me about like Spurs basketball being fun to watch now than there used to be. I think there's good focus on that. Recently.
When the Spurs played Detroit, it was a phenomenal series, and people who love basketball loved that series. Yet
people weren't talking about it.
No one watched it.
No one watched it.
But now everyone loves the Spurs, but when they, in 2006, they didn't love the Spurs. They thought they were boring, and now
People just weren't paying as much attention.
I think it's all about Boris Dio.
I think the game changed. The game changed, I thought, with the rule changes, because if you remember, all the teams were playing big up front. They were playing, you might have, like in New York, we had Larry Johnson at small forward, Oakley at power forward, and Ewing at center. So there wasn't much shooting on the floor. And it was the physicality of the game became too great, and the rule changes, everyone shifted. Everyone started playing small forwards at power forward, more shooting on the floor, spread you out, and that created a lot more threes too. And sometimes that gets overlooked. But I think the same things win. You're not going to win it unless you're strong on both sides of the ball. So, and I give Pop a lot of credit. He's not trying to beat Golden State's way. I look at his team, and they've gone back now to, it's similar to when Robinson and Duncan were there, and of course Kawhi, and they're playing a power game now. They make quick decisions and they have shooting, but they're going to try to beat you their way, And I think a lot of teams that are trying to play like Golden State's very unique because of Draymond. Draymond has the ability to guard all 5 positions, and Iguodala oftentimes gets overlooked because of his ability to play the 4. When they go small, they don't sacrifice their defense in the rebounding, and they can play even faster offensively. And if you're not aware of what you're going to do against their switching, that's a problem. And so I think that you have to look at your team and the personnel you have and determine what's the best style of play to give you your best chance at winning.
Right, so that sort of gets back to your organizational priorities question. And it really depends on the state of your team and the goals of your team. So, for example, we've got some personnel right now, probably taking more mid-range shots than some people analyzing the game would have our team taking in an abstract world. But with the people we've got, some of those shots make a lot of sense. Some credit to Philly, actually. I think, and you'd have to ask them this, but I think their goal is long-term to win championships. And what they want to do, right, but they're more focused on that than they are necessarily about, is the guy making the most points per possession that he could make today. So they're trying to create a culture. For all the knocks they've gotten about culture that they've created, they're trying to create a culture where the people are taking the best shots. And I think that's the long-term goal.
They can't make them, though.
Well, it's an issue today.
That is an issue.
So,
But I think that's
I'm
what
not
you have to
defending
look
everything
at.
No,
about
no,
the
I
Sixers, but I actually think there's something to that, right? So you're trying to create some sort of organizational culture. I think Brad's done an amazing job with our team creating a culture around the way we play. And it may depend some on the players that you've got, and it may depend some on what ownership tells you to do, and it may depend some on how the whole group works together. But that's the intricacies of working in a big group.
Yeah, do you look
But
at
I
that
think, like,
differently?
yeah, well-
long-term versus short-term?
Well, I think you have to look at your team. You know, where are you with your team? Are you rebuilding with your team? I think establishing a style of play is very, very important. I think that's what Brad has done great. I think that you guys have a style of play, and I think the skill set of the bigs has really opened up the floor for your guards, and you know they're playing to their strengths, and they're playing great defense, and that's the way you should play, because I think that's the way you grow and develop. You have to be strong on both sides of the ball. But getting back to Kevin Garnett, he was a great 18-foot shooter. Like any shot from the top of the key area was like a layup. So if you told him to take a step back and shoot the three, he would not be effective. And so like that was smart to let him play to his strengths. I think you see a lot of that with Aldridge now in San Antonio. And I think playing smart is important. You know, like you'd like a guy to be able to make the corner three, and obviously if you have a range shooting four, that changes things for you offensively. Everyone wants those guys, but sometimes you don't have those guys. So I think everyone playing to their strengths and covering up their weaknesses, that's important.
Would you take a Taj Gibson and say, all right, this offseason we want you to be able to make the corner three?
Yeah, you know, like I thought you always should give a guy a goal. Like we were hoping that we could stretch him out to the corners, and he couldn't. He wasn't comfortable doing it. So I think when you have two bigs, you have to think about how you're going to space the floor late. And so we had Joakim Noah and Taj Gibson. So we would put them on one side of the floor. So Taj would usually be at 18 feet in the corner, and if the ball got swung and he didn't have the shot, we would have him go into a quick dribble handoff up to the wing to get our guard to get that shot where we thought we could get the three. So those were things that, you know, you have to try to look at your personnel. Like I'd rather have a guy who can shoot the three, shooting the three, and then go from there. Like the thing about Golden State that makes them so hard is when Curry comes off Draymond, you don't want him to have any space, and Draymond's pulling back to the three, and then his ability to make plays, not only to shoot the ball, but to put it on the floor and make decisions, that's one of his great strengths.
Are you guys surprised by how much traction the should we move the three-point line back because of Curry discussion has got? When it first came out, I was like, this is just nonsense, it's going to go away. But it keeps kind of coming up as like, as players, as if we get more Currys, or if we get more guys, or if we get more Corey Brewers who are allowed to shoot as many threes as they want, should we consider moving the line back? What do you think of that discussion, and what would it do to the game? Like, how would the game change?
Game is good right now. Why would you change it?
I agree,
mean,
but it's not going away.
like it's fun to watch Curry. I mean, if he pulls up if he's 4 feet back and he's shooting at a lower percentage, I'm not sure it's as fun to watch.
Well, I think if you move it back 6 feet, he's still shooting it. So
Yeah, but he's
and
the only guy. So what do we want? Like
I
no
know.
threes? We want threes.
No, I agree with you. I think it's it just changes, as you explained with the spacing. It just changes the game and how you play it. And
Yeah, if you moved it to half court, there'd be no spacing. You'd be
Right,
back to the
right.
game from the 9. So there's some point at which, but I don't. Antoine's going to still shoot him, right? Because there are no fours.
Antoine Walker was my favorite player for a long time. We have some audience questions here. I'm just going to go right to the best one. I mean, these have been curated by students at MIT. So these are the ones that MIT students, smart people, have selected. One of them is Brian Scalabrine. How were you able to dominate the league for so long? This is a real question.
Not even the smartest people at MIT can figure out how I had an 11-year career. I don't even know how I do it. There are guys way better than me coming and going in the NBA, guys signing 10 days. How did I get 11 years?
Don't you want this on your team? Come on.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Really, the last 2 he gave me. So I really think if I have a 9-year career and a 2-year favor from Tibbs. And the last 5 you gave me.
What was the minimum salary during those 2 years?
Like, yeah, he got me like $2.4 million that I wasn't even counting on, just for being a good guy. That's unbelievable.
Hey,
This
look,
world
that
is
matters.
ridiculous.
Elton Brand is getting a minimum salary right now in Philly for being a good locker room guy. That matters.
I know, but at one point he has like this unbelievable respect. I mean, he was a former, he was almost an MVP. you're talking about a totally different level. I don't know how I did it. I don't understand the phenomenon.
Now, you lasted-
But I do buy into the phenomenon.
You lasted.
Give the fans what they want.
I give them what they want. Give the people what they want.
Paradoxically, you lasted less than 1 year as an NBA coach.
I got demoted.
You got demoted. One of the first coaches ever sent down to the D League.
That happened. That
Tell me
actually
about,
happened.
but like there was one bit of analytics that I think was interesting during your time in Golden State. You used lineup data to argue for the importance of a certain player to play more. Can you tell people about
Let me
that?
tell you who my 2 guys were that I wanted. These are my guys that I worked out. One guy was Andrew Bogut. The other one was Draymond Green. So when you work out a guy, you pump your guy to play more, play more. Those were my guys, and we don't want to get into all that, but it was, I did as much as I could with data to prove that these guys are really good for our team.
This is for anybody. This is open-ended. I think it'd be interesting. You're going to have to be careful to avoid tampering charges. Are there certain players or player roles, I guess, that are over or underplayed by current metrics? If so, who? So who should play more? Who should play less? Like who's a guy? Who's a Draymond on a bench that should play more, or who's a guy that's playing too much? Anybody?
You guys can talk about specific names if you want, but I think that we get questions like this a lot, and I think the premise is a little bit wrong because you're never playing a guy in a vacuum. You've got 4 other guys on the court, and so you're not going to choose to play some guy more not knowing who else they're playing with, ever. That doesn't happen in the NBA. You don't have a coach who says, you know what, there's this guy on the bench, it doesn't matter who else we're playing, we need to play
But I
him
do
more.
think
It's
there
very
are
rare.
interesting guys. Like the name that came to mind is like an Ed Davis put up amazing permanent stats his entire career, never played, coaches didn't like him, whatever. Now he's playing really well in Portland.
Well,
It's
we
like,
felt Jay Crowder was one of those guys, so we went and got him.
Okay. Any other names
But I
come to
think,
mind?
well, you also look at your lineups in the fourth quarter. Who are you going to surround your best players with? And then there's guys that make shots in the fourth quarter. They're big shot makers. They may shoot a lesser percentage earlier, but they shoot the 3 well in the fourth. And you're going to tend to surround your best players with those type of guys to open the floor up. So I think that information is important.
Any other names come to mind?
I just know like this, if you're a center or a power forward especially that doesn't create space, you can't rebound their position, I mean, we're probably eventually not going to have a job. So,
What did you guys think
Well,
related?
I think every team has a guy like that. Like when you look back, like Battier was one of those guys. Like his numbers never reflected how valuable he was to
His
the
numbers
team.
did, just different numbers.
Yeah,
different numbers,
You would have
yeah.
to put you're right. Some numbers were excellent. Posey was like that with us in Boston. But I think when you look back, Bruce Bowen in San Antonio, every team has had Haslam in Miami. You know, like when you look at what they brought to the team, like Luol Deng in Chicago, I never thought his numbers reflected how valuable he was to the team.
What did you guys think? All of you follow the league very closely, obviously. What did you guys think of the kind of louder than usual debate about whether Hassan Whiteside was helping the Heat this year? Because he became for some reason the guy whose plus minus on-off splits were used to kind of discredit him. And I just think people are trying to figure out, is Hassan Whiteside good? I don't know, you've seen the Heat a bunch of times. You've seen the Heat a bunch of times.
like another thing that I believe in, you got to have centers that can pass the ball. I think Hassan Whiteside in 2,000 minutes has
Single digit.
15 assists.
Maybe- or maybe
you know,
50.
like you watch Chicago, watch the way Joakim Noah gets 16 assists in 2 games. Hassan Whiteside, 2,000 minutes. So I like, especially the way the game is played, the way they call the hand check, the way the pick and rolls dominate the game. You better have some bigs that can pass, and it's going to open up the floor. If you don't have bigs that can pass, I think it's hard to win. Even though he's a beast. I mean, he can rebound, block shots, he can dominate. Personal style of play is bigs that can stretch, bigs that can pass, and also try to rebound your position.
Super common statistical error though, right? Like availability bias, right? So you've got this plus minus stat that everybody knows somewhere inside it includes information on a player's contribution to the game, right? But it's really complicated because there's 9 other guys out there, and it's different guys at different times when he's on the floor. And so people want to conclude something one way or another from that stat, and you really shouldn't.
And over a very small amount of
very
games.
small amount. I mean, it turns out you need many seasons of that, that piece of information to glean something about a guy. And but it's available now. It's actually in the official box score for the first time. So people are looking and say, oh, he was plus 14 tonight. He must have been really good. Or Hassan Whiteside's playing with their bench a lot early in the season.
Right.
Oh, he was -10. I mean, he must be having a negative impact. You can't just look at that number and conclude really anything. So, you know,
Unless you wanted to.
unless you wanted to, right?
I mean, are there any players, on a larger question, are there any players that you've analyzed or watched where the numbers really changed what you thought of them, where a new analytic or a new type of stat or just diving into stats on them changed your eye test evaluation of that player? For me, it was DeMarcus Cousins, and specifically DeMarcus Cousins' defense, which I just thought was lazy and reaching and sapped morale of the team. All the analytics were amazing, and I started watching him differently and noticing stuff. Are there guys like that the stats changed what you thought of them?
Omer Osik was like that for us in Chicago. Like our second unit, the first 2 years was terrific. It was C.J. Watson, Ronnie Brewer, Kyle Korver, Taj, and Omer. And Omer came in as a rookie. I didn't know how much I was going to play him, but every time he was on the floor, I played him in the preseason. The second unit was great. Every time they were in there, and he was limited offensively. He was a great offensive rebounder, great screener, and the unit always functioned well. Like he knew every play, he knew what the opponent was doing. So I think for me it was him.
Yeah, another one. Kirk Thomas is also
Interesting.
Yeah, he was good. I mean, Omer and Kurt, no matter who you put in that position, their position defense for bigs, it's very, very underrated. A lot of people don't talk about that. But if you have a 7-1 guy like Omer and he's standing right between LeBron and the basket, no matter where he went, LeBron keeps his eye on him. And he was reluctant to challenge him every single time when LeBron was in his prime.
Well, I was going to say not necessarily a specific player, but when we first started introducing some of the SportView stats, it was a bit of an experiment, what made sense. And just from a fan perspective, and the coaches probably already knew that. You knew what guys were good at adjusting those shots. Fans didn't have an appreciation for that. When you start putting out there, like, field goal percentage when a guy's around the rim, and you start to see guys, you're expecting all the shot blockers, right? Yeah. But it's actually the guys like Omar, like, Robin Lopez was up there when we first did it, and everyone was like, really? Like, he averages, like, not even a block a game. But he wasn't blocking the shots, he was just there, and he was altering the shot. And he was making an impact, and then you weren't able to measure it. And again, you guys knew that, and you could see that, but now with statistics, you can actually rank it and put numbers to it, as opposed to it just being a feel of the game.
Well,
and that's what's interesting, you see that for coaches. Yeah, and it's interesting, it draws between what the coaches see and feel, and then you tie that back to what fans see at home, and they have a better appreciation for it. It's not just guys spiking the ball into the crowd. It's the guys that are having that subtle impact on how well people shoot.
We had that effect sort of with Shaq when we had him for a short time. People
forget about the Shaq Celtics era.
People thought he couldn't move and his defense was terrible, but other teams weren't taking anywhere near. It wasn't like even the field goal percentage. The shots weren't happening in the lane when he was in the game. Even though he was nowhere near the pick and roll. Like usually the guys, soft or blitz or doing, but Shaq was just standing in the lane back.
Yeah, but a couple years ago, there's a paper here about the Dwight effect, it was called. That was when we first started looking at SportView. And it wasn't the field goal percentage, it was guys wouldn't even attempt to go to the basket because he was there.
You see that with Marc Gasol, you see that with Andrew Bogut. Yeah. They're not the best at the rim. I mean,
Bogut.
No,
Bogut's
not
a beast.
at the rim. The percentages aren't. But you got to remember, you don't want the ball at the rim. You want to discourage the ball from going to the rim. So anytime there's a play at the rim, that's a bad thing. Discouraging the ball, being up, kicking the guy out, and then getting back to yours, that's what you really want, which you don't, no one sees that. The fan doesn't say like, wow, do you see how he discouraged Damian Lillard from going to the basket that time? You just see the end result, a blocked shot. It doesn't work like that. It's all about the positioning before a guy's already turning the corner. That's a high-risk play. You don't want to rely on your center blocking 10 shots or having 10 challenges at the rim. You're going to get fouls. The guy's going to get out of the game. Discourage the ball from getting to the rim.
There's a lot of centers in free agency this summer and a lot of cap room. It's going to be interesting to see how guys like Roy Hibbert get paid and how the league values that skill when it doesn't have a flip side skill on offense, as you were talking about with passing. But the time has hit 3 zeros, which means the basketball analytics panel is over. I hope you guys had fun, and thank you to all of our guests. And yeah.